As of recently, I've seen a growing sentiment that makes it seem Synchros have become the second most hated mechanic in the game, at least according to the selection of comments on the Link video. It's baffling to me that so many people seem to have a disdain for this mechanic. I think this is likely a result of most modern Synchro design. However, when I held a poll on people's opinion of the mechanic, most seemed to still have a positive sentiment towards the mechanic. While the mechanic ran the gambit every mechanic does upon release, that gambit being changing the game, or as the stupid would say, ruining the game. Like how Xyz ruined the game with Utopia OTK? Remember that? 'Cause I don't. But when people actually were receptive to the newly added mechanic, players appreciated what it offered to the game and grew to enjoy them in some respect. Of course, this mechanic wasn't always this despised. In fact, it was plenty beloved, especially in retrospect with legacy formats like Edison. Although, personally, I don't really care that much for Edison. Mostly because I feel like the Synchro Pool is a little too shallow a sandbox for my liking. And that's something I'd actually like to draw attention to even now. The general Synchro card pool. Despite being the oldest summoning mechanic added to the game, it's getting ever closer to being outnumbered by the newest one. This fact leaves the general Synchro Pool to feel underwhelming in the grander scheme of the game. Anytime I find myself in a scenario where I can Synchro summon, there's really not that many options for good generic Synchros for most levels. Leaving Synchros to feel relegated to specific Synchro-focused archetypes rather than a general mechanic decks can have access to. And from the looks of what people said, that also seems to be a sentiment, with most people agreeing on the sentiment that Synchros are worth playing in some capacity. What exactly has led to this reputational decay? Well, it's pretty simple actually. Synchro as a mechanic has had its identity stolen. The thief in question? Links. Synchros are just links, but with an abacus. The mechanic requires a tuner, a specific subtype, as well as a non-tuner on board, and the ability to do basic math, which for some people is a little too steep an ask. Links require almost any monster on the field, and have a far more vast and powerful card pool than Synchros. A majority of links don't have any unique design restrictions, so any scenario where you could make a Synchro, you could very well just make a link instead. When I ask people what mechanic comes to their mind when they have two monsters on the field, by an overwhelming majority, links are the extra deck mechanic that people think of when reaching into the extra deck. It's pretty obvious why, and the current design space for links makes them an infinitely better use of your resources. This wasn't the case when XCs were introduced. They had clear mechanical distinctions that didn't invalidate Synchro's identity. They required monsters of the same level. This rarely left chances where one invalidated the existence of the other, and the scenario overlap between making a rank 4 or a Synchro 8 still had meaningful decision-making between choosing. XCs even utilized the overlay materials to establish a legitimate functional difference between using the materials as cost for effects or the rare instances of gaining additional effects based on the materials attached. It made sure the mechanic was distinct from Synchro in the game's ecosystem, even past the advent of links. Since Master Rule 4 was put to pasture, the fact that 99% of links had zero consideration for actually linking, co-linking, or utilizing combined link ratings for their effects makes it clear links have no functional distinction between Synchros. And when it's the better, more easily accessible mechanic, it's the one that runs away with the identity. I mean, it doesn't get any more on the nose than Halka Fibrex. Who would have thought designing an entire card type around a single arbitrary restriction wouldn't age so well in a world where you remove that restriction? So what was Synchro's response to this stolen identity?
I'm gonna steal it back.
This has led to a growing negative perception towards the mechanic. Long forgotten the era of summoning Stardust Dragon. Gone are the days of Crystal Wing gaming. Now we have this. Time to execute the combo. I'm just built different. There really is no better example of what links have done to this mechanic's identity than Synchron. You're locked into synchro summoning at the expense of all the extension the deck is capable of, because if you weren't, you'd be doing something far more heinous. Which is really saying something when you see actual Synchron gameplay. Synchron, TG, and Blackwing, iconic 5Ds era archetypes, are now just 50-minute combo fests. Even Battle Wasp is starting to shape up in this playstyle, likely a side effect of being a clone of Blackwing. RDA, while less heinous in gameplay, still has a relatively drawn-out process to go through. So much for speed. These decks functionally do what most degenerate decks do, but at a snail's pace. And on a bunch of dumb negates. Or, in Blackwing's case, 3 assholes that burn you to death for daring to play the game. Who designed these cards? Who looked at Blackwing and thought, ah yes, what the deck is missing is a focus on burn. That'll really invigorate the player base's interest in this deck. Remember in the anime, when they made a point to show off Accel Synchros as a way to interact on your opponent's turn? Stardust dodging an effect, becoming Shooting Star. Yeah, me neither. Just treat Synchro climbing and Accel Synchro like Link climbing with extra steps. Great. Why Synchro climb into Crystal Wing, or anything for that matter, when you could be committing those resources to Link climbing? You can make Cerberus or Phoenix to out a card, then climb into Unicorn to out another. While you may have had to discard cards for both effects, the point still stands. Link climbing has far more universal value than Synchro climbing does. More often than not, you're Synchro climbing into a card you actually want. It was a very cool and rare occurrence in older formats when you got that level of mileage out of climbing. Now that's just free with links. So, Synchro climbing is seldom ever used, as the resources committed to it would be better used for Link climbing. Also, let's not forget this little guy needing to be eradicated from the face of the planet as a result. An entire facet of this mechanic has been entirely invalidated. This has led to cards like Assault Synchron that say, please for the love of God, use the Synchro mechanic, I'm begging you, don't link this off, and Revolution Synchron that lets you just use it from hand for a Synchro, because if you could special summon it, you wouldn't be using it for a Synchro summon, I'd wager. You can revive it to Synchro climb, but that doesn't Synchro lock. So you know this bastard is getting used for Link climbing in any deck that isn't Synchron itself. Gen X has more recently become the same type of deck that Synchron is. Just spinning your wheels for 10 minutes, summoning a billion guys, playing solitaire till you've hand-looped your opponent out of the game, or made the standard negate board if you're feeling a little zesty. TG got support that made them far more capable of Accel Synchro summoning, but just like Synchron, it's all in the service to an unfun, tedious gameplay loop. This type of design is only serving to tarnish the entire mechanic's reputation in the game, and only serves to paint a picture that Konami thinks this is the best design course for an entire mechanic. It isn't. While it may be fun to solve the dual puzzle of Synchron and TG the first few times, I can't help but feel like it's a convoluted process that dulls the more you're forced to go through the hoops. And when the luster of its puzzle-like gameplay wears off, so does any care for the deck. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we have Shiranui. They're horrible, unless you're talking about Duel Links. Then they're the scourge of the earth. They're far too slow to even function in modern game. Shiranui was a deck that was capable of Synchro climbing, using the main tuner Spectral Sword and a Material Engrave to Synchro summon, for you to then use a tuner on field with that Synchro to Synchro again. I like this deck's design premise. It's just a shame it's far too slow and low-powered to actually be playable. But that doesn't mean they need to spit a billion Synchros a second, like its sister archetype. Maekashi, its sister archetype in lore, falls more in line with the modern Synchro philosophy. You ladder climb Synchros with a singular tuner, and then Link climb after, just admitting they're the same thing at this point. The cool design balance in this is that you're using a ton of extra deck slots on the deck's core strategy, meaning they don't have a lot of space for broken generics. Just ignore the fact that Daki already locks you into Maekashis anyway. I like that the deck is literally designed like a ladder. You climb up all these levels and links, then, when they're destroyed, you climb down into the cards engraved and they get their effects. However, in practice, this means sitting through this.
What a thrill, with darkness and silence through the night. What a thrill, I'm searching and I'll melt into you. What a fear in my heart, but you're so supreme.
Because extra deck cards have to be properly summoned first, we couldn't have just designed a way to mill them all. We have to sit through each individual summon, with Ducky reviving every single time. Konami's aware of this fact, because they just made a skill in Duel Links to get around that. But without skills in the main game, all Mayakashi really amounts to is Bone Tower Mill. Riveting. Manatium is another prime example of the ugly side of modern synchro design, a deck that just goes and goes. It's not fun to play with or against. It utilizes unique aspects like using only tuners for its synchros and Vsauce's effect for destruction, leaving a unique playstyle in theory, but of course the reality is far less interesting. It's just a different flavor of the same synchro slop. Making Barone and any other collection of negates because they couldn't be bothered to give the deck an actual game plan beyond just spamming the board. The only modern-day synchro deck that's playable and not plagued by inherent degeneracy is Sword Soul. Sword Soul are all one-card synchros. You summon one of them and they generate the tuner to make a synchro. Apparently I'm an asshole for not enjoying this clear watering down of the mechanic. You do technically need another card to get said tuners, revealing, discarding, or banishing for cost. This cost is functionally inconsequential. It's consequential in deck building, which is the best way to go about balancing any cheating design gimmick, but this sets the precedent for what a healthy synchro deck is like. I don't know about you, but the healthiest deck of a mechanic forgoing its key aspect rubs me the wrong way. The fact that the archetype is synchro-based feels arbitrary. I mean, what's stopping them from just being worm links? It feels like since the only other two existing worm archetypes have synchros, they decided synchros were an obligation, but in doing so made it have no real commitment to the actual mechanic. Sword Soul has no unique interaction with tuners because they don't have any actual tuners, unless you count Golden Sword Soul, who isn't a worm. Would you still hate me if I was a worm? The deck has more meaningful interactions with non-effect cards, and that's the most unique facet of the deck. Synchros just felt like a tacked-on obligation, since it's just Link summoning but worse now. The decision to be synchro-based does give the deck access to the 8 and 10 pools of synchro, with the only 8 you're summoning being the archetypal Chi-Shao, and maybe Draco Berserker. Why do you forget me? And while I think Changing is a really cool monster, well, this deck isn't exactly making its own level 10s first. No, we have a special card just for that. A generic Omni-Negate on a 10. Remember when you had to work for this? Barone basically is the synchro mechanic now. You know we're cooked when the only synchro monster people associate with the mechanic over her is the literal godfather of the mechanic, which means it's dead in the TCG. Of course, a generic Omni-Negate is gonna see widespread play. The hell did you think was gonna happen? Barone feels like Konami thought level 10 synchros were harder to make than they actually were, since no one ever makes them, not considering the fact they hadn't printed a single good generic 10 until then, and so they made a card that makes the 10 pool permanently invalidated. Wonderful. Barone's reign didn't just lock down the 10 pool, it locked down the whole synchro pool, being the only synchro worth summoning. In my survey on synchros, Barone was a constant, absolutely everywhere from most common Synchro people summon at 13 entries to the most commonly seen Synchro at 28, as well as the Synchro people hate the most. The only Synchro that rivaled P.U.N.K in hate was Calamity, and you people really hate this bastard. P.U.N.K had like 50 different variations in spelling for each question, but when it came to Calamity, near everyone dropped his full name and address without skipping a beat. The only other constants were Borreload and Chaos Angel. Shout out to whoever specified they summoned Chaos Angel in Digital Bug. Why would you use a tuner on anything but cards like P.U.N.K or Borreload? As we established, the Link Pool is far better and far more accessible than the Synchro Pool. So much so that in order to actually get you to use the damn mechanic, the payoff has to be an Omni-Negate. Reflect on what this means. Let's actually look at the Synchro card pool for a minute. Synchro 12s mostly consist of Excel Synchros and double or triple tuning Synchros. 4 of the 26 Synchro 12s are Stardust's ultimate forms, and 3 of them are RDA's ultimates. Outside of them, the 12 pool isn't super well developed. You have the 2 Centur-ion Synchros and Crimson Dragon as the only other notable 12s. It's not very explored, with the Centur-ion cards being the only massive shift for the level pool. Well, the Crimson Dragon also contributes to that shift, but we'll get to that in due time. There are 7 11s in this game. Oh shit. Synchro 11s are more tricky to make because it's a big odd number, so it's great that the pool kinda sucks. Pep is the only good generic 11. Amazing Dragon and Clearwing Rider are pretty neat cards restricted to their own decks. I think 11s have plenty of potential for boss monster design, as their odd level makes them far more difficult to summon generically. We just need to see more cards designed with that principle in mind. 10s have 54 cards, and in spite of P.U.N.K being the face of it, there's actually a sizable portion of notable cards. Dispater, Chaos Angel, Changying, Dragion, Gamer Agerine, Goatee of the Deep Beyond, and Lancia. These are all noteworthy cards in select decks. 10 is also home to some real dog water synchros. Majestic Stardust, Shooting Star Dragon, TG Blade Bastard, Nirvana High Paladin, all cards that don't do much while being trickier synchro peripheral mechanics. What I'm getting at is that high-level synchros felt like they were intended to be special with Excel synchros and whatnot, but beyond just power creep itself, aren't worth making in the first place. Why properly make Quasar or Blazar when you can just cheat them out with Crimson Dragon? Why cheat out Shooting Star Dragon when it's not even remotely the best 10 you can cheat out? I don't think all high-level synchros should be tricky to summon. Like I said, there are plenty of notable ones that even get overshadowed by P.U.N.K. But unlike P.U.N.K, those cards have niches. Some of them less niche than others. But you don't see them instantly being slotted into every list that has a tuner. Big number is fitting for a big boss. Cards like P.U.N.K are not a boss. They're a nuisance. I want to see more big boys in the game. I just want to see their design treated with care, being powerful cards that fulfill strong niches, and not an all-purpose endboard piece. The 8 and 7 pool are the most commonly accessible synchro levels, and despite that, they feel kinda shallow. You have Stardust, a card that, while not terrible, doesn't really Stardust doesn't really factor into a modern endboard piece, even though it'd be nice as one, seeing as you're more likely making an archetypal 8. G-Shell, Bashia, Jam Dragon, Dragite, Draco Berserker. Instead, you're making Stardust Excel, not to Excel Synchro Summon, but to summon P.U.N.K. Fantastic! The most popular generic 8s were Borreload and Chaos Ruler. Both of those idiots are banned, and now it's clear how poor the generic offerings of the pool are. Unless you just want to rip a card with Omega. Isn't that a fun use of your time? There's also Crystal Wing, who is a monster negate you have to actually make by synchro climbing, or cheating him out with Crimson Dragon. But for those who have a billion IQ, Supreme King Clearwing is clearly the better summon. When it comes to 7s, things get even worse. The only 7s you're ever likely to see summoned are Bident Dragion, Meteor Burst, and Ancient Fairy Dragon. And you're not having fun if you're seeing these cards. Cards you may see once in a blood moon include Shooting Riser Dragon, Clearwing, and Dawn Dragster. Cards you may see on Tumblr include... The only other 7 of note is Black Rose, and it's a card that isn't good in the game's current environment, but could always make a comeback if 7s were worth a damn. Ignore what I just said. No one told me you play that shit in Tenpai. This deck really will just play anything that has 7 printed on it, won't it? When it comes to 6 and below, I don't think I need to go into that much detail about how underdeveloped the pool is. There are just a lot of wild cards that, once again, don't do enough to justify making them over links. There were plenty of staples in the early days like Goyo and Brionac, but not really anymore. Tell me the last time you summoned a 6 without edging. For some reason, level 6 Synchros just draw cards. I don't know who decided that's what these cards should be doing, but okay. With cards like Penguin Brave, Mind Castlin, and Centur-ion, the 6 pool feels like the fun zone at best. There are the White Forest cards, but anything you put in a deck with Runic I'm just gonna discard from my memory. The 5 pool is harboring known war criminals, Junk Speeder, Naturia Beast, and Fitzgerald. And 4 has the Horse. It just gets more depressing the more you look. So let's look at what other people thought. I conducted a survey on Synchros to gauge the community's thoughts on the mechanic. Granted, the pool is only 49 deep, so I can't say for certain it's a reflection of the consensus on a grander scale. But I do believe it provides insight as to how people feel regardless. To ensure I have a larger sample size to go off of in the future, this is where you now go into the comments and open the XD survey I've pinned in the comments in a separate tab. That way this issue doesn't repeat itself, as I'll be doing a video on XDs like this in the future. On with the results. The most common archetype people selected as their favorite is Synchron, but there's also those who focus more so on the other Yusei cards, without mentioning Synchron specifically. This makes sense since it's Yusei's archetype, regardless of its current playstyle. I'm pretty sure replicating the anime is enough to sell most people. Add to the fact there are people that like the puzzle-like aspect. In second, or first if you disregard all the other Yusei options, is Speedroid. People seem to really love Speedroid because it actually uses its own synchros. Of course, it can make Barone and Crystal Wing, but Crystal Wing was literally meant to be played in this deck. The third most liked was Goaty, another archetype that plays into its own synchros, while also having some room for generics like the white synchros. And in fourth was a tie between TG and P.U.N.K. TG is a deck similar to Synchron, that's by design, and so my feelings on it are generally the same, and I can only assume that's the same consensus with the people that like it. P.U.N.K is an interesting combo deck that I feel has the same core gameplay loop of Synchron, but actually goes about having a more healthy game plan in accomplishing it. The field spell is functionally just TG Librarian for the archetype, but it's actually balanced around the deck's structure, as well as the deck's actual end goal is interactive, using their synchro to bounce as an interruption. P.U.N.K also has flexibility with rank 3s. It's a very open-ended toolbox deck, and I can absolutely understand why people like it. People's favorite archetypal synchros also help paint a picture. First place is a tie between DDD, Cursed King Siegfried, and Ice Jade Gimir Agerine. Siegfried is an archetypal spell and trap negate, but is one of the more nuanced negates that require the card to be face up on field in order to negate it. Gimir offers your monsters protection, and if her effect is chained to another, she gets to banish a card. Add to the fact that she can come back from grave when a card is banished. While Gimir is far more generic than Siegfried, it's pretty apparent with these two that people really value monsters that provide the archetype with actual insulation. Goaty of the Deep Beyond is the boss monster of Goaty and provides the deck with an actual win condition. It being in second reflects the archetype's placement as one of people's favorites. To my shock, also tied in second is Shooting Star Dragon. It was the first Excel synchro from Yusei with an incredibly hype introduction. Shooting Star also looks cool. Junk Speeder, P.U.N.K Amazing Dragon, Shen Shen, Stardust, and Odd Eyes Meteor Burst all tie up in third with 2 votes. This abundance of ties only illustrates to me that plenty of people are drawn in by a ton of archetypes. There is no 1 or 2 definitive decks people latch onto, which is a testament to just how many ways you can enjoy synchro decks. When it comes to people's favorite generics, things get a little more questionable. Although most of the answers given are technically archetypal, it's abundantly clear through actual play they are a little more generic than their name lets on. And first is P.U.N.K, which I'd attribute to Stockholm Syndrome. Pep also tied for first, from those who aren't suffering Stockholm Syndrome. Pep is just a cool card. It appeals to the ape brain with its massive numbers, but also demands both players approach the game more attentively, making sure your opponent can't find a way to drop their life points enough to nullify its protection. Second is a tie between Changing, Warlord, and Chaotic Magical Dragon. Third place is another tie between Stardust and Chaos Angel. While Stardust is a constant like P.U.N.K, it's clear not enough people feel as strongly about it in the game as more prominent modern cards exist. Chaos Angel is of course another modern staple synchro, so it makes sense. Its banish effect also isn't once per turn, which I feel is why Chaos Angel is both a despised and loved card. When it comes to people's favorite tuners, the most popular was Junk Synchron, another case of anime favoritism and how iconic the card is. And second, it's a large tie between Excel Synchron, Blazing Cartesia, Formula Synchron, Harmonizing Magician, Odd Eyes Synchron, Plague Spreader, Vsauce, Virtual World Lulu, and 2 people put NA as their answer. Then third would just be everything else written down. What we can discern from these favorites, though, is that people like tuners that actually provide more than just their subtype to the equation. Most of them making synchro summoning easier or help the deck generally well. I can only assume the commonality of NA means that most people don't really end up caring for tuners, feeling like they don't fulfill much beyond just synchro summoning. Easily the most hated synchro archetype is Sword Soul, with Tenpai in a close second, and Synchron just behind it in third, with Centur-ion and Blackwing being just out of the running. Well, it's pretty clear the most hated synchro archetypes are in fact modern decks, especially if they were meta-relevant. Sword Soul most likely because of P.U.N.K and Protoss's involvement, Tenpai because of its lack of involvement in gameplay, and Synchron as it's the poster child of the worst modern synchro design has to offer. It highlights the fact that it is one of the decks you may enjoy playing, but no one actually enjoys playing against. The most hated archetypal synchro is Calamity. Second was Naturia Beast. Third is NA. So it's actually Junk Speeder, assuming the person who put Junk Warrior mixed them up. Otherwise, someone really hates the worst beater in the game. Notable third place contenders are P.U.N.K and Boral showing up again, once again skewing the meaning of archetypal. Primeheart, who I assume is here because he sucks, and as a result ensured Monadium would just play out as the degenerate deck that it is now. Transcendent Dragion also shows up. I couldn't possibly fathom why. The fact Centur-ion synchros have a low representation here, and Calamity's massive showing, makes it clear that what most people really hate about Centur-ion was Calamity. The same sentiment likely extends to Sword Soul and its usage of P.U.N.K, though they may still hate them for Protoss as well. The NAs also make it clear people also don't necessarily hate archetypal synchros, which is in line with how people actually liked archetypes that use their own synchros. Naturia Beast is pretty self-explanatory. The thing is just a floodgate, one that invalidates 3 card types. That's really great to keep around in the game. Most hated generics are they're pretty obvious. P.U.N.K first and Boral second, except tied in second is the Crimson Dragon. The Crimson Dragon is a really neat tool, but it also served as the card that would cheat out Calamity. And even with Calamity gone, it now just cheats out every Excel Synchro Stardust in the game instead, which are all negates. And this is played in Centur-ion, resulting in a gameplay loop that is just about as unfun still. Third is Chaos Angel, also Calamity tied with it, but this is meant to be generic, just a sign people don't even see it attached to its archetype. Chaos Angel is somewhat of a polarizing card. You either hate it because it's a powerful synchro that doesn't actually require a tuner, or you love it. for that same reason. When it comes to hated tuners, first place is Ash. No way! The most hated tuner is the card that's a staple notably not used for synchro summoning? You don't say! Other tuner hand traps make an appearance, but it's pretty evident that Ash is the one at the forefront of people's minds. Second place is an actual tuner in Jet Synchron, likely due to its current role in Snake Eyes, paired with the scars Hulk has left people with. Third would technically be NA, which I assume is a result of people not feeling strongly about tuners one way or the other, be it negative or positive. But if we're skipping over to actual cards, it's a tie between Chandra, Diviner, Destrudo, and Daki. Diviner, I presume, because of all the synchro summoning it doesn't do, Destrudo as an extender in a game of never-ending extenders, and lastly, Daki. I already went over why Daki is such an annoyingly designed card already, so we can wrap this segment up. So, I forgot to address Chandra. People just hate this deck, it sucks. Everything about it sucks. I'd honestly forgotten the fact that most hand traps in the game are tuners for some reason. I was reminded of this fact by most people writing them under their most hated tuners. I think what bothers me about hand trap tuners is that, barring psi frames, they're not really designed to ever be used for synchros. Of course, sometimes it does come up where you just normal Ash and make Barone, but it also brings into question, what's up with the design of tuners? But before we move on with that train of thought, a dishonorable mention goes to Ice Barrier and Lancia. They showed up quite a bit as well, and why wouldn't they after the stinker of an event that was the Water Wind Festival? Lancia fixes Ice Barrier, but in doing so, reared the archetype's ugly design in a spotlight it should have stayed out of, summoning obnoxious floodgate idiots from the deck. Wonderful. With this summon effect being once per chain, mind you, compounded with the fact that Lancia also floats into Trish, counting as a synchro summon to hand rip you an out of card on field, and yeah, this card design is pretty annoying. As things are now, Links and Synchros can't really coexist. One design difference that prevents Synchros from being able to interact with Links is that they don't have levels. XCs don't have levels either, but they aren't the ones stealing their functionality. I think this could be remedied by designing some cards that treat a Link as a tuner, with their Link rating or a multiplicative of it being treated as a level for a tuner. Now, this still doesn't solve the issue of the card pool comparison, but I think this design direction is a way to start building a bridge for the mechanics to come together in a healthy relationship. Start doing more with what can be a tuner and how they interact with the other mechanics. Ghoti doesn't need to be taught how to synchro summon. It needs to be taught how to swim. Ghoti is a very exceptional design premise for a synchro deck. The problem is, it's dependent on fish, a monster type with very little synchro synergy in the main deck. As of recording this, they just dropped another shark that enables XCs. Keep them coming! And most of the archetype doesn't actually remedy this issue. What in God's name were they thinking designing this deck? Ah yes, the best design premise for an archetype is to have 0 starters. In the survey, it was pretty common for people to say their favorite synchro archetype is Ghoti, and it's not hard to see why. It actually aims to play the game in an interactive manner. The second most popular synchro archetype was Speedroid, and the sentiment seems to be that people actually enjoy it when the synchros facilitate the deck's game plan. They exist as actual flavor to not only the deck, but also the mechanic itself. Just because Links and synchros are functionally the same currently, doesn't mean that has to be the case. Konami has to make a commitment to actually setting synchros apart, and archetypal synchros and synchro decks actually manage to highlight that fact. People seem to hate more modern synchro archetypes like Centur-ion, Sword Soul, and Tenpai, but how much of that hate is directed to the archetype at its core? Centur-ion's main game plan for a while was to summon Calamity off of Crimson Dragon, and of course, no one finds that fun to play against. Sword Soul was a deck that could consistently make Barone and Chi-Xiao, functionally 2 negates. Doesn't help they can also use Protoss to floodgate you out of the game, but Tenpai is a little more layered. The field spell is the most obvious offense. Konami took the laziest design route for the deck and just made sure it couldn't fail at its game plan, mixed with the fact that the deck can lethal through Prosperity, and consistently, not exactly the most well-balanced. and the deck can get away with playing a million hand traps and still going full combo unimpeded. It's an archetype that is catered to the game's current unhealthy environment, and that's not a good thing. I absolutely love Tenpai's playstyle on paper, but its actual implementation is just atrocious. I love the fact that you actually attack with the main deck monsters, then perform the synchro summons to then attack with them, giving it this feeling of an endless assault with all the attacking. It's extremely satisfying, but it is all in service of just killing your opponent with absolutely zero resistance. It also leaves the deck with no going first strategy, so people realized you just fill that blank in with turn skips. Wonderful design principle, that is. Sword Soul, should it actually use Changing and Chi Xiao, is a decent gameplay interaction. Chi Xiao is a monster negate that doesn't destroy, but in sequence with Changing, it very well can be. Or it can destroy another more pressing card. However, you don't want to expend these effects all at once. They're actually a neat combo that contributes to more dynamic gameplay. It's just a shame the deck is left to do far less interesting things instead. I love Centur-ion. I love that we finally decided to utilize continuous trap monsters so they can be used as actual interactions. I love that there's level modulation to give the deck versatility with the synchro card pool. But as said before, Calamity did tarnish this deck's reputation. Given Centur-ion's theming, I would have liked to have seen the deck actually perform Excel Synchro summons, but their levels don't really allow for that. The deck can combo off, but it definitely leans more into building up on your opponent's turn, being able to use the girls to synchro on your opponent's turn with the field spell to, get this, interact with your opponent. It actually gives the deck a healthy and strong foundation. Centur-ion very much feels like GOTY, but playable. I just hope the fish catch up, and they start making more synchro decks that can maintain this positive gameplay loop. Chaos Angel is a bit of a contentious synchro card as shown. It can be made without a tuner and clearly plays into the light and dark chaos theming, with you being allowed to treat one as a tuner to summon it. Other than being a powerful generic card, I think it's niche enough that it's an alright card to exist. The issue with cards like Chaos Angel is that they invalidate the mechanic in a way by just not needing a tuner. I think cards designed like Chaos Angel should have additional benefits should you make them with an actual tuner. Honestly, I'd like to see similar synchros using fire and water, as well as wind and earth. The design is niche enough that I think having them be staples would be an overall healthy addition to the game. When I asked people how they feel about more synchros that are made non-traditionally, people seemed interested in more cards being designed that way. You have Prime Heart with the same non-tunerless loophole that Gotham's had, except this time was definitely deliberate. And also, it's worse. And the same goes with Synchro Vsauce. I think it is interesting to turn the mechanic on its head so long as it fulfills a unique goal of expanding upon the mechanic. Oops, all tuners is a problem that has plagued synchro decks before. It'd be interesting to see an archetype of only tuners making it harder to use generic synchros with them, but not being entirely impossible if you're adding in another engine. In my Archetype Architect video on Gradle, I had the idea to make a new form of synchro summoning that involved cards blowing up for the synchro summon. This allows for Gradle effects to trigger in sequence with performing a synchro summon. I mean, rockets do the same thing with Boral Fusion, so why not? The context of specific decks can highlight the place the mechanic still has in the game with these mechanical distinctions. The survey really did just remind me that a lot of hand traps are tuners for no real reason, because Ash was by far the most hated tuner. But when it comes to tuners that aren't also a staple of the game, people seem to hate cards like Daki and Jet Synchron, cards that come back to get more value. Now, we discussed this earlier. These cards were intended for synchro climbing. Jet Synchron has been to hell and back for the sins of others. Daki is more egregious of a card, but is tied directly to its archetype. With the game's current environment, this sort of design is rather unsavory. I really do hope Konami finds a better balance in designing tuners that provide more for synchro summoning and less for link spam. An Excel Synchro is a synchro summon performed with only synchro monsters. But this begs the question, is Excel Synchro a card type or just a mechanic? You can Excel Synchro a card like Barone, but that doesn't make it an Excel Synchro monster. Perhaps designing new Synchro boss monsters with added benefits should they be made via Excel Synchro is a good design space to follow. People seem to think Excel Synchro can't be anything but combo spam. This is the most narrow-minded thinking possible. Centur-ion and Goaty remember the fact this is a two-player game, and as a result, actually seek to pace out their combo between both you and your opponent's turns. This design space is applicable to any facet of the game, including Excel Synchro. The literal first showcase of an Excel Synchro was Shooting Star being summoned during Primo's turn. It was part of what made Excel Synchro so appealing because it felt like entering hyperdrive to dodge effects. The problem is, people seem to hate decks that play on your turn, even if what they're doing is something that's actually engaging and interactive, even if your opponent spent less than a minute on their turn. Speaking of playing on your opponent's turn, while the Crimson Dragon may be my favorite Synchro, I don't think it can stick around for too long. Calamity already highlighted one of the war crimes you can commit with it. This is reflected by how polarizing the card itself seems to be. Something Crimson Dragon can do that is cool is cheat out more niche Synchro Dragons, but ultimately it's a little too open-ended and easy to summon for it not to cause problems down the line. It potentially limits Synchro design space in the future. Add to the fact that there's another asshole that can cheat it out, of which is a Blue Eyes card. Yeah, I don't think Crimson Dragon's gonna be the one that gets to stay. Ideally, I'd love it if the Crimson Dragon was errated to be like the new Clearwing, where you can make it through double tuning or Excel Synchro. I think the Crimson Dragon is a fair payoff for that cost, but Crimson Dragon can literally cheat those out and invalidate that entire process. Also, tilting entrainment in Pendulum makes it functionally innate. Too bad every Pendulum tuner under the sun has to be banished to the ether if they dare be summoned from the extra. In defense of Crimson Dragon, if you really think about it, it did force Konami to slaughter Borreload and Calamity. Food for thought. What I'm trying to say is, I will cry if you ban him. There aren't a lot of double tuning synchros in the game. You have all the RDA cards, and of course, the new Blue Eyes synchro, leave it to the whites to steal our culture, so that's why it's called White Destiny. And Crystron, Quarian Gandrax, who is perhaps one of my favorite synchros in the game. My favorite thing about the new double tuning Blue Eyes is that you're not even meant to summon it properly. That's pretty cool design, Konami. How about you actually utilize your game mechanics for a purpose, huh? Triple tuning is currently exclusive to the Red Nova retrain, but I'd honestly like to see more experimentation with multi-tuning even at lower levels. I know the Majestic line of synchros suck. Well, maybe not the original Stardust if you summon it off Crimson Dragon, but I'd honestly like to see more cards designed similarly. Not in how they function, but how they're summoned. You had to do this awkward process beginning this awful level 1 with no inherent special summon, another level 1, and Stardust or RDA to summon them. I think designing synchros with these trickier setups is absolutely fine on paper. They just have to be far more doable and far less awful. They can serve as a way to make them more balanced, with not every deck under the sun being able to vomit them out. Extending off of that, synchros that require multiple non-tuner materials like Trish. This is less tricky nowadays, given how easy it is to spam the board, but the math still matters. Making low-level synchros that require multiple materials opens up interesting design avenues for decks that have lower levels. Just, make sure some of them aren't in the game by that time. Like I've repeated many a time, Goaty and Centur-ion make it clear quick synchro should be far more present in their design. It prevents the bloat of synchroing a billion times in one turn to bore your opponent to sleep, and actually demands you and your opponent interact with each other intricately during each game state. Reverse synchro was a thing with dark synchros in the anime, and was then later added to the game through Earth's Arctic. I think having more cards like this that turn the mechanic on its head introduces far more depth and nuance to the mechanic as a whole. Take, for example, a generic tuner that could copy a monster's level, effectively sapping that monster's level to 0 in order to synchro summon a monster of the same level. Of course, making it still a proper synchro summon, so you still need the correct listed materials. That way we aren't just cheating out things like the horse, and instead cheat out something like Cthugua to counter Riziel. Another interesting gimmick is with the Whitefish synchros. They all become tuners when revived. It'd be interesting to see more cards that become tuners under specific conditions. Imagine if there was an archetype with no tuners, but they utilized another mechanic like fusion to create those tuners. And similarly to fish, they become tuners under certain circumstance or are easier to summon than most fusions. It gives more mechanical depth to the archetype's design and blends two mechanics together. Also, I just want a deck that can play Harmonic Synchro Fusion and actually summon good cards. Burst Griffin is a cool concept, just a shame it's a Salamangreat card, and Salamangreat doesn't really care about using its reincarnation gimmick for anything other than links. I'd actually like to see more design like it, whether you make Salamangreat pivot to having a separate Synchro build, or apply it to another archetype, I'm in. As I've alluded to, Konami should be doing more to flesh out the level pools. There is not a whole lot for the mechanic to do generically, and there's still plenty more depth to explore. When asking people how they feel about the mechanic's exploration as a mechanic, most people seem to agree it's not at its cap yet, and the level card pools are evidence of that. It'd be nice to see an archetype based around both Xyz and Synchro, and having coordinated levels and ranks. Having the main deck consist of 1s, 3s, and 4s to make ranks of those numbers, as well as Synchro 2s, 6s, and 8s. There's even potential to integrate Excel Synchro, and if you want to be neat, make the boss monster in Xyz that gains its best effects with an Excel Synchro attached as material. Another Synchro concept that hasn't been explored is an archetype that can Synchro summon with your opponent's monsters, like Unchained does with Lynx. Of course, because of levels, this is much more finicky with Synchros, but I believe it opens up interesting opportunities for design, either in having on-the-spot level modulation to account for your opponent's monster levels, or even ways to manipulate your opponent's levels, and maybe even excel against decks that use monsters of a specific level. There are also the weirdly specific counter traps that Synchro summon, but not actually, the Parshath and Blackwing Dragon cards. It'd be interesting to see this become a little more common. I mean, Stardust Road exists, there's plenty more unique ways to implement similar designs. Lastly, Assault Mode, another mechanic that gives more nuanced dynamics to Synchros in the game's environment. I have an entire video about it. Go watch that so this video isn't an hour long. The bottom line is that Synchro design should lean more towards an interactive design just like every facet of the game should. These 30-minute combo piles aren't good for the game's health, no matter what color the border of the card is. Synchro is a mechanic that I think still has plenty left to give to the game. There's so much room for growth in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But Konami seems to stumble over themselves when it comes to a lot of these decks. Be it undertuned or overtuned. I'd just like to see this mechanic remain a beloved part of the game, and not another bullet point on a list of this game's perceived flaws. And right now, it seems like we're trending in the right direction. I only hope that it can stay that way, and find better balance. See you again when I talk about Xyz, which will actually be a more positive entry in the series. So that means no one will watch it. Bye-bye!